Pub History, the show where we share our favorite stories from Boston history. This is episode 73, Molasses Flood, Remastered. Hi, I'm Nikki.
And I'm Jake. This week, we're going to try something new, revisiting one of our early topics now that our technology and our research skills have significantly improved. First up, Boston's Great Molasses Flood. But before we talk about rum, anarchists, and the speed of molasses, spoiler alert, it's not slow. It's time to take a look at this week's featured historic site and upcoming event.
For this week's historic site, we're featuring the Claw House in the heart of the North End. The brick house was built circa 1715 by master bricklayer Ebenezer Claw as a home for himself, his wife Thankful, and their growing family. Today, the home is one of the oldest buildings in Boston. For almost 100 years, the home was lived in by the first two generations of the Claw family, and then Joseph and Sarah Pierce. The home was inherited by their daughters and their politically active husbands, including Moses Grant, a participant in the Boston Tea Party. Eventually, the two daughters moved out and a third story was added to convert the building into apartments in 1806. In 1959, the property was purchased by the Old North Foundation.
Recently, the Claw House underwent an archaeological dig that yielded a treasure trove of artifacts. From the City of Boston's website, in 2012, the city archaeologist was approached by the Old North Foundation about conducting an archaeological survey ahead of excavations for a new pathway in the rear yard of the Claw House. Initial map and historic research indicated the property had not had much development in the backyard, which increased the chances of an intact archaeological site preserved there. In 2013, the city archaeologist and a team of volunteers from the City Archaeology Program excavated 10 1-by-1-meter excavation units in the rear yard of the house. The team recovered 36,465 artifacts from 300 years of occupation and use, as well as an extensive and often repaired drainage system network in the small rear yard. Artifacts are dominated by ceramic and animal bones from the many families that lived in the house. Many 18th century artifacts were found, as well as a sizable assemblage of artifacts from the 19th century, making comparisons between the single-family, upper-middle-class families that lived in the house first and the many lower-income immigrant families who lived there later possible. The Claw House site artifact assemblage and associated historic data provides a thorough and rich data set that spans several significant periods in the North End's demographic history. Men, women, and children from a wide range of ethnicities and incomes are visible through the archaeological record, providing a rich and detailed story of the people who called the Claw House home. The 36,465 artifacts have been digitally cataloged, and a report of the results of the fieldwork has been completed. A master's thesis was completed by Andrew Webster through the UMass Boston Historical Archaeology Program, exploring the immigrant story of the Claw House through the 19th century artifacts.
Today, you can visit the Claw House by stopping in at Captain Jackson's Chocolate Shop. Old North describes the shop as such. Visitors touch, taste, smell, and experience 18th century chocolate as it was enjoyed by some of Boston's most famous Revolutionary-era patriots. Captain Jackson's, the only shop of its kind in New England, explores the history of chocolate, including how it was produced and consumed during the American colonial period, and its connections to Boston and the Old North Church. Daily demonstrations illustrate how chocolate was made and enjoyed by colonial Bostonians. Captain Newark Jackson, an Old North congregant for whom the shop is named, owned and operated a chocolate shop in the North End in the 1740s. Located on the campus of the Old North Historic Site, Captain Jackson's opened in 2013 as a living history, educational space, and retail shop. In March, the shop is open on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. In April, you can visit Thursday through Monday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. with extended hours during school vacation week, April 15th to 22nd. Beginning in May, the shop will be open daily, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. until November 15th.
For our featured historic event, head to King's Chapel on Thursday, April 5th at 6:30 p.m. for a special lecture from Joseph Warren biographer Samuel A. Foreman, commemorating the anniversary of Warren's funeral held at King's Chapel on April 8, 1776. One of Boston's best-remembered speeches of the Revolutionary era was the eulogy for Dr. Joseph Warren, delivered in early April 1776 at King's Chapel by congregant Perez Morton. Join Warren's biographer to revisit this compelling personality. An American doctor, influential son of liberty, patriot, and president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, Joseph Warren played a central role in the events leading to the American Revolution. He managed the siege of Boston during its formative early months and fought dramatically at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Learn about the circumstances surrounding the retrieval of Warren's remains from Charlestown and how Perez Morton's words helped define Warren's legacy as a national hero and a fighting martyr of the American Revolution. Sam Forman is a historian, Harvard University faculty member, and businessman. He has published and lectured on historical topics that inform current issues. Forman is the author of Dr. Joseph Warren, The Boston Tea Party, Bunker Hill, and the Birth of American Liberty, the young adult romance 21 Heroes, and an upcoming epic pioneer journey across geographical and racial frontiers in the early republic. This event is free and open to the public. A suggested $5 donation is appreciated to support King's Chapel's preservation efforts and the history program. And now it's time for this week's main topic.
In an article appearing in the Smithsonian in 1983, Edwards Park recalls, "When I was a boy in Boston and had reached a sufficiently sophisticated age, I was allowed to go downtown by myself. I was finally deemed capable of handling the ancient subway system and the narrow, clogged streets, and I responded by making ritualistic expeditions from the boring security of the Back Bay to the perilous excitements of Washington Street. This was my Gobi Desert, my Mountains of the Moon, my Tarzan country. My target was always Ivor Johnson's, the famous old sporting goods store that captured the hearts of Boston lads in those days. It faced on Washington Street near the edge of Scully Square, that opening in the cowpath streets where stood the Old Howard, a burlesque theater famous for supplementing the curricula of Harvard students. Always something doing, 1 to 11 at the Old Howard, read its ads in the Boston Globe, followed by the titillating phrase, 25 beautiful girls. Scully Square was off limits to me, and no wonder. The way to reach Ivor Johnson's was to take the subway to Park Street and walk northeast to a wonderful little byway called Cornhill, which pitched downward to Washington Street. You could smell Cornhill before you reached it, because at the upper end was the Phoenix, a coffee house marked by the aroma of freshly ground beans. The rich scent filled the streets around and lured customers by the score. Along with the coffee smell was another, equally pervading. One could discern throughout much of downtown Boston, and especially around the North End, the unmistakable aroma of molasses. As a boy, I never questioned that odor, so strong on hot days, so far-reaching when the wind came out of the east. It was simply part of Boston, along with the swan boats in the public gardens and the tough kids swimming in the frog pond on the common. But years later, when I was on the staff of the Boston Globe, I asked a colleague about it. We were walking over toward the North End, beyond Hanover Street, and our taste buds were guiding us toward one of the corner trattorias where North End Italians make, I swear, the world's finest pizza. And for once, I was annoyed by that other smell, the Boston smell. "Why does Boston smell of molasses?" I asked my friend.
The answer to that question reveals one of the most unusual events in Boston history. January 15, 1919, was an unusual day. It started out cold, but warmed up fast, with the reports saying it hit as high as the 50s. Thanks to climate change, this is no longer quite so unheard of, but at the time it was practically cause for celebration. Those temperatures weren't expected for months. As a result, everyone found an excuse to be out and about, running errands, chatting with neighbors, or taking the long way to a destination. Around 12:40 p.m. in the North End on Commercial Street, people were startled by a loud noise. Reports say it sounded like a machine gun followed by a freight train. At the foot of Copp's Hill, patrolman Frank McManus was on a call box speaking to someone at the station. He saw the neighborhood landmark, a 50-foot tall, 2.5-million-gallon tank of molasses seemingly explode and unleash a 15-foot-high tsunami of molasses that barreled through the neighborhood at 35 miles an hour. He yelled into the call box, "Send all available ambulances, all police, everybody." After a late-night tending bar, Martin Clardy slept in and awoke to the sound of the explosion in his family home near the tank. "I was in bed on the 3rd floor of my house when I heard a deep rumble," he recalls. "When I awoke, it was in several feet of molasses." The home was swept off its foundation, crashed into the elevated railway tracks, and essentially disintegrated around Martin. Disoriented but unhurt, he pulled himself back into his bed frame, which functioned as a boat in the molasses. He pulled his sister to safety, but his mother and brother perished in the flood. In his article, Park describes another tale of survival. It caught young children on their way home from the morning session of school. One of them, Anthony DeStasio, walking homeward with his sisters from the Michelangelo School, was picked up by the wave and carried, tumbling on its crest, almost as though he were surfing. Then he grounded, and the molasses rolled him like a pebble as the wave diminished. He heard his mother call his name and couldn't answer. His throat was so clogged with the smothering goo. He passed out, then opened his eyes to find 3 of his sisters staring at him. Another sister had been killed. They had found little Anthony stretched under a sheet on the dead side of the body-littered floor.
The molasses leveled nearly everything in its half-mile path and pooled waist-deep. A Boston Post reporter wrote, "The sight that greeted the first of the rescuers on the scene is almost indescribable in words. Molasses, waist-deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form. Whether it was animal or human was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass, showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on a sticky flypaper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise. In the end, 21 people were killed and 150 or so were injured. So many horses were killed because there was a livery nearby that we never got an accurate count." While the Engine 31 firehouse was knocked off its foundation and the would-be first responders were trapped inside, rescue efforts were significantly bolstered by the 116 cadets from the Massachusetts Maritime Academy who were on board the USS Nantucket and saw the explosion from the harbor. As volunteers waded into the muck that had begun to gel, a role reversal took place at Engine 31, where several firefighters were trapped and treading water, so to speak, in a molasses-flooded pocket of space on the collapsed first floor. Rescuers freed the men after several hours of cutting away floorboards and debris, but not before one of the firefighters lost his strength and drowned. Rescue efforts continued for 4 days, and the last body was found in Boston Harbor in April. Cleaning up 2.3 million gallons of molasses was no easy feat. Salt water from the harbor was most effective in breaking down the gelatinous river, but it seriously polluted the harbor, which was brown until the summer. Molasses traveled far and wide throughout the greater Boston area. Rescue workers, cleanup crews, and sightseers alike tracked molasses through the streets and spread it to subway platforms, to the seats inside trains and streetcars, to pay telephone handsets, into homes, and pretty much anywhere that people went. Everything was sticky and smelled of molasses.
The August 2013 issue of Scientific American contains an article by Ferris Jar, or perhaps Yar, that explains why molasses was more destructive than water would have been. The Boston Globe summarizes the findings. To fully understand this bizarre disaster, we need to examine what makes it unique. Its very substance, Jar wrote in the article. Unlike water, molasses is a non-Newtonian fluid, meaning that its viscosity, or its thickness, changes based on the outside forces that are applied. For example, if a non-Newtonian fluid like yogurt is shaken or stirred rapidly, it becomes thinner and can be poured from a container. Consider non-Newtonian fluids such as toothpaste, ketchup, and whipped cream, Jar wrote. In a stationary bottle, these fluids are thick and goopy and do not shift much if you tilt the container this way and that. When you squeeze or smack the bottle, however, applying stress, the fluids suddenly flow. Because of this physical property, a wave of molasses is even more devastating than a typical tsunami. In the beginning, the molasses was moving so quickly and there was so much of it that it had enough force to rip buildings apart. As it went on, it slowed down and became more and more viscous. Quickly following the collapse, victims filed 119 lawsuits against United States Industrial Alcohol. The company built the tank on the harbor side of Commercial Street, opposite Copp's Hill, in 1915 as World War I increased demand for industrial alcohol. But the construction process had been rushed and haphazard. The tank was used for storage during the transfer of molasses between ships in Boston Harbor and railroad tank cars. It leaked and groaned, and the executives were warned by at least one employee that the tank was unsound. USIA ignored these warning signs, caulking or patching the leaks before simply painting the tank brown.
It's important to note that the plaintiffs were not just a group of working-class immigrants without resources. The Boston Elevated Train Line filed suit because the tank blasted into and severely damaged its elevated tracks. Civil engineering professor Charles Spofford of MIT, an authority on structural engineering and bridge design, was hired to prove that USIA was at fault. Spofford found that the thin steel plates could not withstand the pressure when the tank was filled to capacity as it had been on January 15th. Additionally, the tank did not contain enough rivets to secure the plates sufficiently. With its weak walls and shortage of rivets, he concluded, "In my judgment, the tank was improperly designed and its failure was due entirely to structural weakness." He calculated, "A stress as great as 18,000 pounds per square inch is as high as should have been permitted under any circumstances." However, the fatal load of 2.3 million gallons exerted pressure of 31,000 pounds per square inch on the tank walls, a figure nearly double that which should have been allowed. The plaintiffs claimed negligence, but USIA claimed anarchy in its defense. In this era, Italian anarchists were associated with terrorist bombings in the U.S. Anarchists had bombed a number of the company's facilities in New York earlier in the decade. And just a year prior, in 1918, USIA had received a call from someone threatening to blow up that exact tank. With 40 explosions in the Boston area over the past year, it was well known that Boston's Italian immigrant community included some of the most radical anarchists in the country.
The lawsuits were combined into one 5-year legal drama. Over 1,500 exhibits were introduced and over 1,000 witnesses testified, including explosives experts, flood survivors, and USIA employees. The closing arguments alone took 11 weeks. Mass Moments describes the negligence uncovered. With largely poor and powerless working people facing off against one of the nation's largest corporations, the Massachusetts Superior Court appointed Colonel Hugh Ogden, a respected former military officer, to hold hearings on the matter. After 5.5 years, Ogden rendered his decision. There was no evidence that the tank had been sabotaged. Instead, he found a history of negligence and mismanagement on the part of USIA. The tank's location was chosen because of its proximity to the wharf. The company showed no concern for the safety of the people who lived and worked in the densely populated neighborhood around it. The man who oversaw construction of the tank had no technical or mechanical training. He was unable to read a blueprint or to determine the specifications that would make the steel in the tank safe. No engineers or architects were consulted, nor did an architect or engineer ever inspect it. In the company's rush to finish construction while there was still a demand for industrial molasses, the strength of the tank was not tested before it was filled. To avoid costly interruptions in the molasses distilling process, the manager ignored employees and others who warned that the tank was unsound.
Dark Tide author Stephen Puleo describes Colonel Ogden, the man with so much power and influence over this case. There is no doubt that Ogden, as a soldier and a patriot, would have despised both the motives and methods of the anarchists. and as a conservative businessman, he more than likely shared USIA's concern about excessive government regulations and interference. Had he been a lesser man, the type of man Choate, defense counsel, had counted on, one who let personal feelings and perhaps prejudices guide his legal judgments, a ruling in favor of USIA would have been simple and generated little controversy. But Ogden had a deep set of beliefs, and they were grounded in a sense of fairness and justice. They had been formed early in his life through the influence of his minister father and Ogden's own interest in religion, and then strengthened by his years of military service and his love for the law. His religious training taught him to treat all men with decency and dignity. Finally, in April 1925, Ogden ruled that United States Industrial Alcohol was liable for the disaster. Rather than a bomb, he concluded that the company's poor planning and lack of oversight had led to the tank's structural failure. USIA paid out $628,000 in damages, the equivalent of around $8 million today. In a bit of an ironic twist, USIA had been pushing beyond capacity to produce as much rum as possible before Prohibition went into effect. The day after the explosion, rescue workers were confused when church bells began ringing throughout the city. Nebraska had just become the 36th state to ratify the 18th Amendment, and ratification was complete. That morning, the Boston Herald's front page carried news of the explosion and the announcement that only one more state had been needed to enact Prohibition. There was also a headline describing awful German orgies, and an ad for explosion and liability insurance.
A 1919 Scientific American article reflects on the responsibility of the engineering community to hold itself accountable on behalf of the public. No new technical teachings are found in the circumstances of the Boston molasses tank failure recorded in this issue. The case was simply one of a structure designed and built too weak for its service. It was not more than half as strong as it needed to be. Engineers know thoroughly well how to build tanks so that they will be safe. They have nothing to learn, therefore, from the manner of failure of this scamped piece of construction. But they may well learn, or try to learn, in another respect. It is evident that they do not know how to make sure that their technical skill and knowledge will be applied to the use of the community. They have failed in not creating conditions such that only safe engineering structures can be built in Boston, or for that matter, in any other city. The blame for this rests on the engineering profession, for in the long run, the safety of structures that may endanger life and property is the concern of the engineering profession as a whole. Where does the responsibility lie, and how is it to be made a means of protecting the public? Courts of law will be called upon to consider the case, and they will doubtless attend to the responsibility of the men who built the tank, of those who, while supposedly guarding public safety, allowed it to be built, and of those who put the tank to use and continued to use it in spite of the fact that they might and should have known its dangerous condition. But beyond this, there is the further question of engineering responsibility. Was an engineer concerned in the construction of the tank? Did this engineer jeopardize the reputation of the profession by grossly faulty work, or perhaps by yielding technical authority to an incompetent superior? Or did state and city permit a dangerous structure to be erected without the assurance that an engineer's skill and science had been applied to it? Finally, does the name engineer in Boston mean either competence or responsible authority? Questions such as these go to the very heart of some of the conditions now agitating the profession and give substance to the discussions of professional regulation, of the obligation of competence, and of the need for group action by engineers. Surely the malpractice of whatever engineers were connected with the fatal molasses tank is a matter of personal concern to the technical community, just as definitely as a lawyer's malpractice is of concern to the legal community wherein he labors. There is such a thing as a professional conscience, and it is rooted in the simple but compelling truth that the reputation and the livelihood of every member of the profession depend on the good conduct of every other member. Lawyers have organized bar associations to be custodians of the legal conscience. But who is the custodian of the engineering conscience? When we study this question carefully and find an answer, we shall have set a signpost that in the confusion of movements for state local, national, and ultra-centralized organization points unmistakably to the ultimate unit structure of the professional community, the local group.
Despite being a massive industrial structure in a residential neighborhood, the tank had gone up with little regulation. Buildings, bridges, and other structures required the approval of and the filing of engineering blueprints with the Boston Building Department, but not tanks. Construction was rushed and corners were cut to meet a December 31st, 1915 deadline when a ship from Cuba bearing 700,000 gallons of molasses was due to arrive. Yet, the legal victory was shocking. In that industrial boom of the early 20th century, plaintiffs lost 85% of suits. Stephen Palaio explains the significance of this case. The Molasses Flood and the court decisions that followed marked a symbolic turning point in the country's attitudes toward big business, for which most of the first quarter of the 20th century had been subjected to few regulations to safeguard the public. After the molasses hearings, despite continued economic prosperity and a strong pro-business attitude in Washington, the public began to fight back. Hugh Ogden's strong language and a clear verdict against USIA in 1925 showed that the country had come a long way in 10 years. A corporation could be made to pay for wanton negligence of the sort that led to the construction, with virtually no oversight or testing, of a monstrous tank capable of holding 26 million pounds of molasses in a congested neighborhood.
In a welcome shift away from the libertarianism of the day, the city of Boston enacted safety regulations. The building department began to require that all calculations of architects and engineers, as well as copies of their signed and sealed plans, be filed before a permit could be issued. Additionally, Massachusetts strengthened engineering certification requirements and began to require the sealing of drawings by registered professional engineers.
Stephen Palaio then went on to describe the significant changes to the local economy as a result of the disaster. The flood essentially ended 300 years' worth of high-volume molasses trade in Boston and New England. While some molasses distilling took place in the city up until World War II, the industry never resumed its level of importance. Sugar prices dropped markedly after the First World War, and sugar replaced molasses as a sweetener. New technologies in the production of high explosives and smokeless powder soon eliminated the need for munitions companies to rely on industrial alcohol distilled from molasses. Molasses, which had played such a key role in the American Revolution, the slave trade, the rum business, and in munitions production, slowly disappeared as a staple product in America and as a critical part of the New England economy. And lastly, Daily Cause describes the impact on the community itself. The North End Italian immigrant community, devastated in the wake of the disaster, underwent a fundamental shift of priorities. The isolation it had practiced up to that point came to an end. The community assimilated the lesson of the flood. By failing to involve itself in local politics, they had abrogated their ability to influence decisions that had direct and profound consequences to the community. It was a mistake the Italian immigrants would not make a second time. Boston's Italian community pursued citizenship and immersed itself in the politics of the North End and Boston generally, its members laying claim to their voice in the decisions that affected them.
To learn more about Boston's Molasses Flood, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/073. We'll have photos and maps to illustrate the trajectory and devastation of the flood. We'll also include contemporary newspaper articles and background information on the history of molasses in Massachusetts. And of course, we'll have links to information about this week's featured historic site and upcoming event, including Andrew Webster's thesis exploring immigration through the artifacts of the Claw House.
If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at podcast@hubhistory.com. We are Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or you can go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please think about writing us a brief review. That's still the best way to help others discover the show.
That's all for now. We'll be back next week to talk about the origins of slavery in 17th century Boston.